Welcome to Against the Law, the myth-busting podcast that aims to sort out what's fact and what's fiction in the ancient world. If you hear our gavel sound, that's the noise of justice hammering down on historical fake news. This week, we're going back to school to learn about how the ancients taught their kids, and how different is it really to how things are done now. I'm Flo, and it's a great podcast for me today because I know pretty much nothing about the ancient world. My teachers today are Mr. Barney, who will be telling us about the ancient Near East, Mrs. Xenia, whose lessons will focus on the ancient Romans, and Miss Alison is currently teaching Class 3B, so we've got our favourite substitute teacher, Miss Meg, telling us all about the ancient Greeks. So, I've got my notebook and pencil case, I've got my arms crossed and my fingers on lips, so come on guys, teach me a lesson.
Well, I guess lots of parents at the moment are doing homeschooling. We're hoping that the schools are going to go back soon, but yeah, I mean, was there homeschooling in the ancient world, Meg or Barney?
So in ancient Greece, there was a kind of combination of formal school and the kind of homeschooling that so many parents have been having to do at the moment. But it was split according to sort of gender lines. So in ancient Athens, for example, boys had quite a formal education at school, but girls would probably be taught at home, like by their mothers, in a much less formal way. But there is evidence to suggest that some girls did like learn to read and write, for example. So obviously, this is when we're talking about girls and education is mainly kind of rich elite Athenian girls. But so there's some interesting kind of images on pots from Athens of women reading poetry from a kind of book roll. So we can kind of extrapolate from that some girls did know how to read and write, but it definitely wouldn't be as widespread as for boys.
I assume that these are pots of a slightly more permanent nature than the ones that we've talked about yeeting against the wall so often.
I really like Samian ware pots, that really red stuff. That always seems to tell a story in like a frieze around the edge. I quite like that you can be like, instead of studying a book to learn about ancient history, I'm just going to really stare at this bowl.
There's some really cool pots that have little kind of almost inset stories on. So you've got your main thing going on the big side of the pot, and then on the handles there'll be a sort of almost like a subplot to the pot story. So they are, in a way, that they're their own form of telling stories.
A sub-pot.
Like a
sub-pot.
Barney.
Hey, that's
sub-pot.
A lot of them are of mythological scenes. There's an amazing one, which is, I think it's Ajax carrying the body of Achilles, slumped over Ajax's shoulders. And it's a beautiful pot. It's so detailed. But then the flip side of that is some of them are these much more domestic scenes, which is where we get this evidence about, girls reading from scrolls. And it's this kind of insight into what life would actually have been like for normal women in ancient Athens, which we just don't get that much in literature.
So if you've got mythology on your pots, did you also have mythology in your school curriculum?
Homer's Iliad, which I'm sure you guys have mentioned before, was a big part of education, and a lot of what children in ancient Athens especially would have learned would be about mythology.
How about in other ancient cultures? Was mythology taught in schools there?
Yeah, so in Roman schools they would also have, it was ancient Rome's answer to Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and that's Virgil's Aeneid. So this was written in sort of the 1st century BC. And it traces a pattern from the end of the story of Troy, pretty much. So after Troy falls, Aeneas, who's a Trojan prince, he sort of picks up the trail. He's a refugee. He sails across the ancient world. He has all sorts of adventures, a bit like Odysseus. But the end of his journey, his fate, is to found a society that later becomes Rome. So it is a bit like Roman's origin story, is Aeneas. And they used to learn about that in Roman school. So the people who went to school in ancient Rome, those would also be boys, and usually boys from wealthy families, sort of middle class and up, really. They would be the ones in school. Sometimes they would have a home tutor, and girls would also be taught at home. But yeah, they would read Virgil's Aeneid, and often they would learn to recite it as well. That was tended to be how things were taught.
So in Roman schools, usually it's for boys who are from sort of middle or upper classes. Is that quite a common theme across the ancient world? Is school reserved only for the higher classes who could afford to send their kids to school, or rather their boys to school?
Yeah, I can definitely say that for the ancient Near East, for Mesopotamia, that it was a pretty elite activity. Literacy was generally quite low, and the technology of writing that they had in Mesopotamia required many years of training. Most of the time in Mesopotamia, it was boys as well. There's no good evidence really of classes full of girls learning how to write cuneiform, their ancient writing system. There do seem to exist a few scribes who were women who signed their name as female scribe, basically, instead of just scribe.
Barney, you mentioned writing in cuneiform, and one of the things that I'm really enamoured by in the ancient world is writing in Pompeii. So I'm really interested in literacy rates, because I know that the writing that's in Pompeii on the walls it's quite crude. Let's be honest. It talks about brothels, about watering down beer, where people have had a wee in the street. And that doesn't necessarily sound to me like a sort of elite class writing on the wall, unless I'm wrong, Xenia.
No, you are right. So this is where an important difference comes in. It's the difference between formal education in school and then an education that you have, I don't know, you could call it like the school of life. You're right, Flo. The archaeological evidence points to a fairly general rate of basic literacy across the Roman Empire. There's a story we mentioned it once before on the podcast. The story of Trimalchio, which is told by an author called Petronius in his book called the Satyricon, and he is a former slave who becomes a freedman and then creates this very, very lucrative business in trade. What he hosts this dinner party, that's the setting for the book. And at this dinner party, one of his guests who's sort of in a similar position says, I always really want to do this in an accent, but that's also stereotyping.
Do it.
I never learnt my geometry or my literary criticism, none of your fancy literature, but I know how to write my capital letters, and I can do my percentages, and I can divide up money.
It was like having my dad in the room, Xenia.
Well, I just think that's great though, because it's like, these are the skills that Trimalchio and people of his sort of level needed for life, and they were really, that was what they needed, and they were really good at it. They made a lot of money out of that. We also know that Trimalchio's wife, Fortunata, she was a pole dancer basically, and then but she was so successful, she was like the Cardi B of the ancient world, and she actually loaned Trimalchio this massive loan to help him get out of a sticky situation with his business, and she managed all of his finances. So not only do we learn that Trimalchio can do his percentages and his capital letters, but clearly his wife Fortunata could as well.
I think that's really true nowadays as well, because I don't think that schooling is a one-size-fits-all thing anywhere in the world at any time in the world, because if you're on a building site, you know how to get things level and even and measure them up and divide, measurements by however much you need, but you might not necessarily have excelled at arithmetic at school.
Definitely. And also, Xenia, I'm not sure if you know anything about this, but I've heard that with the Satyricon, when it was first sort of discovered, the manuscript, people actually didn't believe it was real because the quality of Latin was seen as so bad. But actually that view, I think, has been slightly kind of changed in recent years to allow for the fact that not everyone spoke the same type of Latin and not everyone learned in the same way, but ultimately it represents a kind of broader segment of society.
Absolutely. And we have to remember that in the Roman Empire, most people didn't actually speak Latin. That was the language of the elite. That was the formal language, a bit like sort of French was in medieval England. But most people actually spoke Greek, and not classical Greek, but a sort of a dialect of Greek called Koine. It's actually what the New Testament is written in. It's this sort of, like a slightly easier version of Greek that everyone would have known.
That's so interesting. There's an amazing inscription, a sort of stone inscription from Roman occupied Sardinia in about 180 BC, which is by a man called Cleon, and he sort of identifies himself as an enslaved worker in the Sardinian salt mines. And he makes this inscription in which he thanks a god for healing him, and he dedicates an altar. But the amazing thing is that he does this inscription in 3 different languages, so in Latin and Greek and also Punic. And it's amazing because, like you say, I think it's assumed that he is Greek, his name is Greek, and his Greek is sort of the best of the 3 inscriptions. The Latin has quite a lot of mistakes and stuff, but it's really rare to find a trilingual inscription. It shows a remarkable kind of level of education in old Cleon, the salt mine worker. And I think it's quite moving as well. There's a real determination to sort of write down his name and say what he wanted to say in as many languages as possible so it could reach a wider audience, which is amazing, I think.
So we've talked a bit about writing. What other subjects could I find in ancient schools? Am I right in thinking numbers have their origin in the ancient Middle East?
Yes, we do use ancient Arabic numerals as our own, but those weren't the same as the ones they had in Mesopotamia. In fact, in Mesopotamia they used base 60 instead of base 10. So we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 and then start again. They had systems where you went all the way up to 60 before starting again.
Is that any relation to minutes and hours and seconds?
Yeah, that is actually where we get our arrangement of time from, and also like degrees in a circle, and those basic sort of geometrical ideas that are divided into 60 come from ancient Babylonia.
Oh, that's really neat.
And that's like when you count to 100 to, in playing hide and seek. They must have done that so differently.
Shorter time.
They got way less time to hide. Talking about keeping up with new ways of counting and new ways of learning, I was just thinking, if you're certainly in ancient Roman lessons, geography must have been hard because things were changing all the time, weren't they? With sort of the empire. Was geography ever taught? And was it like, right, last week, ignore what I said. Now we're adding Britain. Was it like that, or was it?
I love that idea. I haven't come across any evidence that geography was actually taught in schools, but there are some really famous geographers from the Roman Empire. Strabo was one, and in fact, a lot of like our understanding of the wider ancient world comes from Strabo's geography. So he actually travelled it's not so much like an academic geographical account, but it's more like a travelogue. He goes around all the ancient world and he writes down what he sees, and he writes down things like local mythologies.
That is so interesting. There's also, I think there's kind of the concept of like a tour guide in some ancient literature, in terms of, because it's interesting that in Rome, like we are, they were very kind of obsessed with ancient Greece. And Xenia, I don't know if you know this text, but in Lucan's Bellum Cavile, which is a sort of epic about the Roman Civil War, there's this story of Caesar going back to visit the ruins of Troy, and he doesn't know anything about it, and the tour guide sort of tells him off for accidentally stepping on a holy site. And it's so interesting. It kind of suggests that maybe Caesar actually didn't have the education that he should have had about ancient Troy and ancient Greece.
Yeah, I guess it tells us about like like Flo was saying, there's sort of different levels of education that you might have depending on what mattered for your social status. Because Caesar was from quite an old senatorial family, so he would probably have learnt more rhetoric than like life skills.
I don't know how all of our listeners think about sort of emperors and kings and stuff in the ancient world, but at least one Neo-Assyrian king, probably one of the most famous, Ashurbanipal, he explicitly states in one of his palace reliefs that he was literate. So it might have not have been the rule at all for kings, because as Xenia was saying about the sort of the necessity of certain levels of education, kings probably didn't really need to know how to be able to read or write, because they were surrounded by their elite court who could do it for them.
There's some interesting stuff about the kind of ancient heroes of Greek myth, and it's possibly a bit against the law to say they didn't just have a kind of military education. They weren't just fighters and warriors. So Hercules, or Heracles, as he's also known, is famous for being really strong, saving people, going from zero to hero, as in the song. But there are some accounts that he did have quite a well-rounded education, but he doesn't seem to have been very good at school. So he had a music teacher called Linus, and Linus was trying to teach Hercules how to play the lyre. That is kind of really old stringed instrument. But it wasn't coming naturally to Hercules, and Linus kind of tells him off and tries to tell him to try putting his fingers in a different position. And Hercules then got so angry that he just murdered Linus with his own lyre, which is not a good way to go, I think. And then when he was tried for murder, Hercules said, he quoted a sort of figure from ancient myth, Rhadamanthus, who says, "Whoever defends himself against a wrongful aggressor shall go free." And then Hercules was acquitted. So the court were clearly like, yes, an annoying music teacher is a wrongful aggressor. So I don't know whether that makes sense in modern terms.
I don't remember that from the film. Also, I would really like to say in Hercules' defence, I had a violin teacher who was a bit like that.
Yeah, no, it is quite a relatable position. But I don't know if many of us would have taken it that far.
Yeah, we're not advocating murder here, kids.
Yeah. Also, I was only 7, so what harm could I have really done? Speaking of being 7 and violence, I've got this picture in my head of young schoolboys in Sparta having to learn how to fight and injure each other. Is that true?
That is definitely to some extent true. I think the modern picture of Sparta as this kind of incredibly military, violent society is basically true. All Spartan boys, or most Spartan boys, would have joined a kind of communal school. They would have lived and ate with their kind of schoolmates and basically learned to fight. There's a weird thing called the Cryptea, which is very kind of mysterious, and we're not quite sure what happened, but Plato has this account of young men in Sparta being sent out into the wilderness with no shoes and no food, and they have to survive, and they also kind of randomly kill people. And yeah, it's this sort of mysterious endurance training, which interestingly the Vulcans have to do a very similar thing in Star Trek. So I've always wondered if that's a kind of reference to the Spartan society. But yeah, it was very violent, and it did include a lot of kind of military training for Spartan education, not much of anything else, although they did do some sort of singing and dancing in that ritual sense. But for example, learning to read and write would have been much less important in Sparta than as in Athens.
So it's not quite the Hunger Games level that I was imagining in my head then.
Well, the Cryptea actually maybe that is essentially the Hunger Games. We know very little about it, and maybe that's because it's top secret Hunger Games material, the 4th Hunger Games book.
So we've had geography with that Spartan education. Sounds like we've got a bit of PE. So what else do we have and do we not have in schools? Do we have textbooks?
There were some really famous libraries in the ancient world. Some of them in Athens, but also in Alexandria in Egypt, in Rhodes, which is a Greek island, and in Pergamum, which was it's in Western Turkey now.
I think early on in the podcast we talked about how you can't really destroy clay tablets without smashing them up. So if you have a fire in your library, which I know was the fate of some of the libraries in the Greco-Roman world, it would only make the tablets stronger. So schools are actually really handy for the transmission of ancient texts to the modern day, because they were copying them out the whole time. They learned by rote quite a lot. And so because these students were copying out bits of epics and religious hymns and like philosophical debates and stuff like that, these have all survived in dozens of copies, hundreds of copies, because the school kids were all sitting there dutifully writing them out.
Did they have, when they were writing on tablets, as I understand it, they use a kind of, is it like a stylus thing to make those sort of wedge shapes? Do we know if is there sort of variation in handwriting and stuff? Were they taught how to write neatly, or was it a bit more of a free-for-all?
You definitely can see variation in different people's orthography, the way in which they write. Often you'll find tablets that had a slightly more temporary use, like a note or a letter. They can be scrawled quite fast, almost like you'd call like cuneiform cursive or something like that. And then they had more kind of neat styles for inscriptions, for example. There's one style of the script called lapidary. i.e. something that's inscribed in stone, which is very regular and very readable. And that was actually part of the curriculum. They were tested in all of these different styles of handwriting for different uses in scribal culture.
Because was anyone else in primary school really excited about when you get to upgrade from a pencil to a handwriting pen? I wonder if there was a kind of similar, if you're a scribe in cuneiform, if it's like a big day when you get your sort of big boy stylus.
That's nice. There's definitely like different ways that they learned as well. Sometimes your teacher would copy out a really long bit of text and then you would copy it out right next to it. And my favourite style are these tablets called lentils, which are round, and the teacher would write on one side and you'd flip it over and write on the back. So maybe when you graduate from lentils to the longer tablets where you're copying on the left and right, maybe that's your was it called a pen certificate?
Yeah.
You always used to get those red pens with
Yes.
blue ink. You know the ones I mean?
Yeah, is it Beryl? Beryl?
Yeah, Beryl pens.
Oh my god, it was such a badge of honour to have one of those.
It was.
So exciting.
But yeah, interestingly, talking about these the school tablets being a really good way that we know about certain ancient texts and basically their curriculum. One other thing to point out is that these are found in what appear to be private homes. So there's not really dedicated schools in the way that we think of as, you know, a separate building. Often it just took place in a domestic setting. And there's one in a ancient Babylonian city called Nippur. They called House F, where they found 1,425 fragments of school texts from around 1800 BC. So this is a proper, you know, although it was a domestic setting, they really were churning out quite a lot of written material there.
That sounds like a frantic night of marking someone's homework, doesn't it? And presumably it was abandoned there if they were all found together. So someone obviously quit.
Crunchy, I can't move in my own home. There's tablets all over the floor.
Beyond learning in school, and we're thinking about children here, but what happens when you age out of the school system? When you're a young man in the ancient world, is there a university to go to? Is there a college to go to? What sort of further education could there be had in the ancient world?
Well, our word for academia comes from the name of Plato's Academy, or Academia in Greek, which actually has nothing to do with anything. The word doesn't have anything to do with education or schooling. It was literally just the name of the area. It was called the Academia, and he founded his school there. So that's where we get that word. And people often call Plato's Academy the earliest university, and it sort of was. For one thing, you didn't have to pay fees, which was exciting, but it was for young kind of upper class men to talk about philosophy, to talk about modern issues, as in modern of the time, and philosophy and ethics and that kind of thing. But there is actually some evidence that 2 women attended Plato's Academy, which is exciting, but they did both have to dress up as men, so it wasn't standard practice for women to attend. But that was kind of the higher education for the young men of Athens.
So actually, Flo, I thought you were going to ask about exams. Before you get to higher education, do you have to pass out of school with any sort of formal examination?
I was just revising before I asked that question, sir.
In this kind of Babylonian tradition, they did have kind of interrogations at the end of school, or a later text called the Examination Text A, catchy title, basically lists one of these interrogations. And there's a brilliant zinger from the teacher towards the end, where he says to the pupil who's being interrogated, kind of you could think of like a doctoral viva, like having to prove your research at the end of your PhD. He says to the pupil, "What have you done? What good came of your sitting here? You're already a ripe man and close to being aged. Like an old ass, you're not teachable anymore."
Ouch!
Zing.
So harsh.
So, you know, I said earlier, like, it's clear that these people were learning for a very long time. And this particular student is a well-mature man by this stage, and he just spent years learning to be a scribe, and his teacher's like, nah, can't teach an old dog new tricks, basically. Which is a nice, that idiom still exists in the ancient world as well.
I'm on my 3rd degree now, so I can understand the position.
Now listen, if your lecturers are saying anything like that to you, you need to go to the head of department immediately. That's not okay.
So no exams that I've come across in ancient Rome, but I did think it was interesting, Barney, that the scribes in ancient Mesopotamia were were elite, because while Roman elites would have had like a formal education, scribes tended actually to be slaves. They tended to be bought for their skill to write on behalf of other people in elite positions.
Oh, so it's a very different kind of cultural respect for the role.
Definitely. They had respect for the skill, but it tended to be one that they felt they could outsource, if that makes sense.
Nice. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
So I was wondering, at school, I wasn't particularly a model student. I got good grades and I was a bit of a class clown, and I quite often forgot my homework, or I didn't pay attention in class. So what were the punishments that you might see at ancient schools?
There's a fun thing in Sparta about punishment, which is that the Spartan boys were taught to steal food, and that was kind of part of their training. So they weren't punished for stealing because it was meant to kind of engender this sense of being strong and being able to kind of fight and forage for yourself and, find food in difficult circumstances. But they would be punished if they got caught stealing. So it's a kind of slightly strange morality around punishment in Sparta. You get caught. You get punished if you're kind of caught in the act, but the actual stealing itself wouldn't warrant a punishment, which I think is interesting.
It's like Fagin and the boys in Oliver Twist, isn't it? That Charles Dickens novel. Do you think if you're a stall owner in Sparta, you'd be like, oh, I wonder why this pitch for my stall is so cheap? And then like the school bell rings and you're like, right, I'm not going here. It's right next to the school. I'm never going to be able to keep any of my stock.
That's such a good point. Very cheap real estate next to Spartan school.
Can you imagine if you swapped Spartan schoolboys with Roman schoolboys? The Roman teachers wouldn't know what hit them.
The worst exchange program ever.
Yeah.
It would be a Lord of the Flies situation very quickly, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
But as we saw from the Hercules myth, sometimes it's worse to be a teacher, as in if you get stabbed to death with a lyre.
The teaching profession in ancient Rome wasn't very well paid. It was fairly well respected, but it was more respected, weirdly, if you were a slave teaching, actually, because then you didn't actually have to pay for your own subsistence.
I think that really goes against the law, against the perception that enslaved people weren't educated people.
In the ancient world, there was a huge spectrum of what slaves could do, like the slave that Meg mentioned earlier, Cleon, who could write in 3 different languages, and yet he was employed as a mine worker. You could get slaves who did do manual labour, who weren't literate, but you could also get slaves who were highly, highly skilled and therefore highly valuable.
It's also, I think, interesting in terms of how we get evidence, because obviously so much of our evidence from the ancient world is kind of fragments or things that have been corrupted. But like with that inscription by Cleon, that probably suggests, even though it's so rare to have a trilingual inscription by an enslaved person especially, it's probably suggests that situation might be more common than we would imagine. But it's just the nature of the evidence that we have. So we get, inscriptions in all kinds of strange places, which again, suggests that there were probably more things going on like that and stuff written on papyrus, but obviously that's so much more likely to have been lost.
I have a solution to this.
Write everything on tablets.
Yeah. 100% clay, baby.
I do find it interesting how people wrote in different ways, and obviously it had to be in sustainable ways. We didn't always have access to paper, and in Victorian times there was also a method by which you would have a sort of a frame in which normally a slate would sit, but you would drip wax into it. So you'd have wax that you'd scratch letters into, and then when you needed to reuse it, you'd melt the wax again and make it smooth.
Well, Romans had wax tablets too, but because it's obviously a lot warmer in the Mediterranean than here, the wax tended to stay soft. So you didn't have to melt it. You'd just fill the tablet with some soft wax. Then you'd write whatever you wanted into it, and if you wanted to rub it out, you just sort of smudged it with your thumb. And every now and then we get someone who's been writing really, really hard on their wax tablet, and we can read what they accidentally scratched into the wood at the back of the tablet. There's actually one example that we've got in the British Museum. It's from Vindolanda on Hadrian's Wall. It's of a birthday party invitation that was written from a woman at a fort near Vindolanda, and it was sent to the wife of the commander of Vindolanda, and this woman is inviting her friend to her birthday party. So it's great. Most of it is written by a scribe who sort of does the formal bit, I invite you to my birthday party on this date at this venue. And then there's just a couple of lines written in this woman's own handwriting, saying the ancient equivalent of looking forward to seeing you there, love you babes, bye.
Does the birthday party invitation suggest that most women who are the wives of military commanders would have been able to write, or does the fact that it's so small, do you think that suggests that actually that would be quite unusual?
No, I think you're right. This is sort of what we were saying earlier with like Fortunata, Trimalchio's wife. It seems that, people, and these women wouldn't necessarily have been very well off. Like this wasn't a particularly fancy position in the Roman military. So yeah, it tells us that fairly ordinary women would have had at least that basic level of literacy. They would have been able to write to their friends if they wanted to. So, guys, what have we learnt today?
I learnt that if you want information to survive through history, you should probably do it on a tablet.
I learned that even in the ancient world, birthday party invitations were a source of great enjoyment.
I really enjoyed learning about Linus, who was killed with a lyre for being a bit of a rubbish teacher. So be warned, all teachers out there.
I like learning about Spartan school and how sometimes it paid to be bad.
Okay, well, as we go and get ready for our school exams, let's also get ready for a physical exam, because our next episode is going to be about hospitals. And ambulances are ready to take us away.
Did you hear that?
Yeah.
Sorry, I forgot to mute. That's perfect.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Against the Law. If you enjoyed it, hit follow or subscribe so you'll get all our future episodes in your feed. We love hearing from you, so please get in touch with suggestions and feedback on Twitter @AgainstLaw, that's LORE, or email againstthelaw podcast@gmail.com. Bye for now.